Welcome to the Week 11 edition of the Fantasy Football Brothers podcast. My name is Blake, and I'm joined here with my younger brother Carson as we discuss matchup previews for Week 11. So how you doing, Carson?
I'm doing very well. I'm ready to jump into this week that only has 2 buys, so hopefully your team is not ridden with a bunch of players on bye, but I guess we can hop right into those 2 teams right now.
Yeah, a couple of, one very fantasy relevant in the Rams and one fantasy relevant-ish in the Broncos. Let's start with the Broncos. Who we got at running back that we're missing?
Yeah, I think the Broncos surprisingly have, they don't have a lot of, I'd argue they don't have any must-starts, but they have a decent amount of must-roster players. So at running backs, we got Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams. Wide receiver, Sutton, and he's been annoying to manage on my fantasy team. Jerry Jeudy and Tim Patrick, and then they also have Fant. So they have a decent amount of relevant players, but not a lot of must-starts, like I've said.
Yeah, and then with the Rams, obviously everyone who has him is missing him. It's Cooper Kupp, and we've found out that Robert Woods is done for the season. That makes the OBJ trade a little bit more fantasy relevant than we initially thought. On top of that, Matthew Stafford, he's been kind of difficult to watch as of late, but also Darrell Henderson, and he was a little banged up, but also Sony Michel is his backup. But yeah, I mean, outside of those guys, not a lot to miss. I think that this is a good week. If you are in need of a win, you're probably not going to lose because of your bye weeks.
Yeah, and if players are on your waivers, such as Van Jefferson and even Tyler Higbee, and they might go unnoticed this week because they're on bye, they might be worth adding just because of the absence of Robert Woods and how good this offense is. So I would definitely consider that depending on your roster construction in your league. All right. So I guess we can move on to the Thursday night football matchup, which is your New England Patriots against the Falcons.
Let's
Super
go,
Bowl
baby.
rematch.
Let's crush. Yeah, 27-3. Ring any bells?
Yeah, 28-3. I was actually watching an NFL Films video on that.
Oh,
today.
yeah, you're right.
Yeah. These teams are not what they used to be, although the Patriots are definitely on the ups. I don't think they'll make the Super Bowl, but, I mean, I didn't think they'd make the playoffs, and I think they almost certainly will if the form they're at right now. What do you think about that?
Yeah, they're riding high, baby. They're hot and they're doing really well. I'm happy to. I'm loving to watch it.
Yeah, this is interesting because the Patriots destroyed the Browns in Week 10, whereas the Falcons were decimated by the Cowboys in Week 10. So it'll be interesting to see if the Patriots can keep it going and the Falcons will bounce back. So we'll start with Mac Jones. 19 for 23, 198 passing yards, 3 passing touchdowns, good for 19.92 fantasy points. And I'll ask you, is he legit?
I think he's a legit NFL starter. I don't think that he's necessarily going to make a lot of fantasy rosters just yet.
Agreed.
But it's promising to see how well he's performing in his rookie season. With limited talent around him. Obviously, Jacoby Myers, as we'll allude to later, he got it done in getting his first touchdown reception. But
yeah, baby.
I mean, the cast of characters around him it's very typical of a New England roster. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I would say it's a lot of people that just get the job done. Something I like about this team that past Patriot teams haven't always had is they have a lot of youth. They have a lot of young players that will only get better, and it's not just a bunch of veterans that Brady could somehow revitalize the career.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying. The other thing is that we have consistent running back play. Even with Damian Harris out, we can talk about Ramondre Stevenson, who just lit up the Browns.
Yeah, insane. And as Blake said, Harris was out. I think he's expected to be back this week, but monitor that status. But Ramondre Stevenson and
No,
Harris's
he is.
absence,
He is expected to play.
Okay.
He has no injury status.
Okay, but Ramondre Stevenson in Week 10, 20 rushes for 100 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, while also having 4 catches for 14 points, 27.4 fantasy points. Blake was forced to play him last week, and it really paid off. Can't say you were expecting that to happen. Ramondre Stevenson also led the team in targets with 5. I love that, and I find that very interesting concerning how much carries he had, too. He was just doing everything. But I'll ask you, what do you think happens to Stevenson when Harris comes back?
So the most exciting part about this is that he's a rookie, and he went into this previous game in Week 10 without practicing at all during the week, and I think that that's really indicative that, like, based on how he performed, that he is very talented. And the reality of that is that even with Harris back this week, he's going to have an increased role in this offense, I believe. I think that, and he showed some chops in the pass game, and I think that that's promising for a team that is missing James White right now. That I think Stevenson's going to be involved in those passing downs a little bit more than he has in the past, and I'm kind of in a position myself that I'm considering starting both of these guys this week.
Oh wow.
But I mean that is a lot. That has a lot to do with my team suffering through a lot of injuries and other things. But yeah, Stevenson is very talented. I'm excited for his future with this team. And I think that he's going to be involved a little bit more than you've seen him in the previous weeks. That being said, Damian Harris is the main guy. He's been very effective. He's scored, I believe, in his last 5 games that he started. So he's obviously still the main guy, but I think it may come down to, maybe a 70-30 split, a 65-35 split, something like that maybe hasn't been the case as of late.
Yeah, definitely interesting because they're both coming off of concussions, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. Something else that, as we've said about this team, just Harris is 24 years old and Stevenson's 23. Like that's got to make you feel good about the future of this backfield.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we young, talented guys that are obviously taking to the system that Bill Belichick's wanting to run. So yeah, it's great to see.
Yeah, okay, we'll move on to Jakobi Meyers, and we already said it. He did it, broke his streak without, in his NFL career without having any receiving touchdowns. He finally did it, 4 receptions, 49 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown, 14.9 fantasy points. You love to see that because even though he didn't have a ton of receptions for what he usually does, he found the end zone. So I feel like that makes you feel better about his floor. But we'll move on to Kendrick Bourne, who had 4 receptions for 98 receiving yards and a touchdown, and 3 rushes for 43 yards. 5th double-digit fantasy scoring game, which is the same as Jakobi Meyers. He's rostered in 3.1% of leagues going into this week, and I know you picked him up in our league, so this probably goes without saying. Should he be rostered in more?
Yeah, I believe so. I think he's kind of emerging as the main guy in this passing offense, outside of Hunter Henry, of course. But I think it's excellent to see that Jakobi Meyers got in the end zone. I kind of like how Kendrick Bourne's being used. He came from San Francisco last season, and you know how they like to incorporate their wide receivers in the run game. So if this is any indication for something in the future, I think it's a really exciting prospect for him. I like his opportunity in this offense.
Yeah, for sure. Hunter Henry, 4 receptions, 2 of them being touchdowns. He has 7 receiving touchdowns in the past 7 games. I mean, it's kind of like James Conner had been. I mean, it's hard to doubt him, but I don't feel great about it. But he's very consistent with it. So, I mean, this was the game without Jonnu.
This is the thing. I mean, obviously, so Hunter Henry's a tight end, and so you have to keep in mind that here's the thing that I think is the most important. Outside of targets, which don't count for points, but it shows opportunity.
Dang it.
The difference is that Hunter Henry he has touchdown upside. I mean, we've seen it. We've seen it time and time again over the past 7 games. So you have to, if you're going to play someone like Hunter Henry, you need to erase those touchdowns and look at the score that he would get, which this week would have been 7.7. Are you comfortable with that from your tight end? If you're not, don't start him. But if you like the upside of what he can do, 19.7 in this past week, I mean, that's top tight end numbers. So that's how you kind of have to value those players.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And this is a good matchup for all these players on Thursday night because the Falcons' defense is relatively weak, ranking 22nd in total yards allowed per game and 30th in points allowed per game. So this Patriots offense should keep on trucking.
I'm hoping for another blowout.
Yeah.
I'm hoping for another blowout.
And I want to say it has not gone unnoticed that you now roster Harris, Stevenson, Bourne, and Henry. Your team is slowly becoming the Patriots.
Hey, they're hot as of late, so I can't deny that.
Yeah, for sure. We'll move on to the Falcons. Matt Ryan, awful day. 9 for 21, 117 passing yards, 2 interceptions, good for .68 fantasy points. He had a Sam Darnold day. Um, although I do
Ouch!
think
I
that
could have sworn you missed a one or something in there.
no, no, bad, bad day for him. And
Yeah,
this
that's
Patriots
terrible.
defense ranks 8th in passing yardage allowed per game at 220.1 yards, so it's not like he's getting a better matchup after this past week. So I don't think you feel good starting him. I do think he is worth rostering, because I do think he is a solid QB2, but I would not play him this week confidently at all.
Well, so then rostering in what capacity? In a two quarterback league, or like because in a 10 team league, I don't think he is worth rostering.
You don't think so? I think he is. I mean, I could be a little bit skewed
Well,
because
look
we're in a 6 point passing touchdown league. Which
look at
probably,
this look at his floor. I mean, this is a game where he played 3 quarters
Sure.
of football. So, there are probably better options out there than Matt Ryan. But in a two quarterback league, you might be forced to use someone like him.
Yeah, okay. I mean, you don't feel amazing about him, especially after this, so I do agree.
Okay.
Cordell Patterson, monitor his injury status. I think
Yeah, he'll be a game time decision.
he's a game time decision.
Uh-huh.
So his stats aren't even really worth reading last week because he was dealing with that. Mike Davis, at this point, I'd say he's droppable. We've been saying that for a few weeks. He had 4 carries for 18 yards, while Wayne Gallman had 15 carries. I guess the old Saquon backup. Didn't even realize he was at the Falcons.
That's kind of an interesting addition for them. I think that it does kind of indicate that Mike Davis is losing his foothold in this offense even more because of that.
Yeah. And pass catchers, Kyle Pitts, the only respectable day out of this horrible loss for the Falcons. 4 receptions for 60 yards. Not amazing, but got you double digits. Russell Gage had another goose egg, 0 receptions. Tajay Sharp had 1 catch for 0 yards. And Olamide Zacchaeus had 2 receptions for 22 yards. Pitts and Zacchaeus led the team in targets. Um, I guess there really isn't a pass catcher worth rostering besides Pitts and Ridley if you're holding on to him. Would you agree?
Yeah, I find myself holding on to Ridley, but yeah, outside of Pitts, I would say it's very difficult to gauge who's going to do well in this offense, and I guess you can extend that to Cordell Patterson, but I think he's
Yeah.
close to 100% rostered at this point.
Yeah, I guess he is. He's a pass catcher. He does it all. But yeah, he definitely is worth rostering. That goes without saying. And this Patriots defense is strong, ranking 6th in total yards allowed against per game at 328, and 2nd in points against, 16.5. So I don't expect this. I don't expect the Falcons to win this game. It's in Atlanta, so that helps. But I think this is gonna be another win for your boys. At least.
Yeah,
you can hope.
so was the Super Bowl.
Yes, that is true. We'll move on to the first Sunday matchup. Ravens at Bears. We talked about Ravens a bit because they were Thursday night for last week. Lamar Jackson, 26 for 43, 238 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown, 1 interception, and 9 rushes for only 39 rushing yards, only for Lamar, I should say. I would say don't panic on Jackson. I know that I read something that he was sent home from practice from being ill. I don't know if it's COVID related, but I guess monitor that. Make sure that doesn't harm his
Yeah, I
ability to
haven't
play,
heard.
but I doubt it.
I haven't heard anything relating to COVID with him. I think it's probably just one of those
He's got a
one of those
woozle.
things that pops up.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Exactly. And again, we talked about this. Surprising day for the pass catchers. Rashad Bateman led the team in receiving yards, and Bateman is definitely worth rostering. It's surprising me. I mean, his roster percentage went up by 15 this past week, but he's still rostered in only 40% of leagues. I think that he should be rostered in more. He's only played 4 games, but he's already been very consistent in those 4 as a rookie. And, I mean, I'm not going to mention any running backs on this team because there's really no one to mention fantasy-wise worth mentioning. So this team's going to be throwing the ball. Lamar's going to be stealing all the rushing, and Bateman's going to have a opportunity to, get plenty of receptions and be a fantasy-relevant option. And then Marquise Brown led the team in targets of 13, but he had a disappointing performance, only 9.7 fantasy points. I expect him to bounce back. He has been very good this season. Mark Andrews had a good day for you. He found the end zone, 18.3 fantasy points. And this Bears defense is relatively weak, ranking 25th in points allowed per game, 24.9. But they are easier to run against than pass against, so I would expect Lamar to get it done on the ground while also probably still having a productive day through the air.
Yeah, let me ask you this real quick, just because this is kind of recent news, is that Le'Veon Bell was released from the Ravens.
Yes.
So, do you think any running back kind of like secures their number one spot in this offense, or is it still a committee any rise?
I mean, isn't it Latavius Murray? And then I don't even remember the name of the other guy.
Devonta Freeman.
Yeah, Devonta Freeman. Okay, that's not even who I was thinking of. I mean, there was, I forget the name of the other running back that everyone thought was going to be the next fill-in, and then they just turned to veterans. Now, I don't trust
Tyson
that.
Williams.
Yes. I think he's a key example of just saying, like, you would have thought a younger guy would have taken over, but no, they went committee. I don't trust that this backfield's going to have a number one guy other than Lamar.
Yeah, I agree with that. Lamar's the running back you want on this team.
Yes, exactly. Move on to the Bears, who were on bye in Week 10. Justin Fields, we talked about this before, had a decent day for him. Still hasn't thrown for more than 100 passing touchdowns. 100. One passing touchdown in a single game. He
Very
hasn't
few
done
have.
100. He hasn't done 100 either, but hasn't even done one. But he did have 291 passing yards, which is good for him. So he could be on the ups, just maybe not this season. But this is a good matchup. This Ravens defense ranks last in passing yards allowed per game at 283.3. So, I mean, it's a good matchup for him. We can move on to David Montgomery.
Yeah.
Or
Okay, go
you
ahead,
want
go ahead.
anything to say about Fields specifically?
I was just gonna say, I think Ravens. So you're showing down here that Ravens defense ranks fourth in rushing yards allowed per game. I'm a little surprised by that, because I think, in the previous weeks we've talked about how you can kind of run on the Ravens, and I think that this might be a good game for Fields to get involved in the running game a little bit more. And we obviously saw how David Montgomery was utilized in his first game back. So I think maybe don't be scared of that ranking so much, but maybe, I could be wrong, but this team's kind of their main focus seems to be running the ball. So just to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and that's Fields' focus as well. So it'll be interesting to see if he feels like he needs to be passing more, but also like that rushing yards. A quarterback that can run is a little bit more nuanced than a team that just shuts down running backs. So it'll be interesting to see.
Agreed.
David Montgomery, 10 fantasy points in his first game back since week 4. I expect his usage to go up even more. And as we already talked about, the run defense for the Ravens a bit. Khalil Herbert, unfortunately, we predicted it. He's droppable. Only had 4 carries in week 10, or week 9, rather. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, unless you roster Montgomery and you want to have that as an insurance back heading into the playoffs, I think that's a safe option. But yeah, in terms of standalone fantasy value, it's pretty much non-existent, which we saw on on week 9.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about a few pass catchers. Allen Robinson, 4 receptions for 68 yards. Darnell Mooney, 3 receptions for 41 yards and a receiving touchdown, and 1 rush for 15 yards and a rushing touchdown for 20.6 fantasy points. And Cole Kmet, 6 receptions for 87 receiving yards. Kmet led the team in targets with 8. We've talked about him before. I think Jimmy Graham was active in this game, so do you think he's worth rostering in some leagues that, force you to play a tight end?
Possibly. I think there are probably better options at tight end available to you, especially because, we talked about how in week 9, this was Justin Fields' best day passing, 291 passing yards, but he still has very low attempts, like less than 30 in this previous game that they played. And so I think there are probably better options. I think he's got a low floor, and I mean, 14.7 is good, but I think it's probably not going to be something you can rely on week to week.
Yeah. And then keep in mind, even though Mooney kind of boomed, Robinson and Mooney both only had 4 touches, so I don't think you feel like this is more to come from them, but yeah, I mean, we've already done a lot of analysis on these pass catchers. I'll be interested to see if Fields keeps on stepping in the right direction. Then that might change our minds, but we'll see.
Let's talk about
Yeah.
Packers Vikings.
Move on to Packers Vikings. Aaron Rodgers. The Packers shut out the Seahawks last week in a snowy Lambeau Field. Aaron Rodgers, 23 for 37, 292 passing yards and 1 interception.
Carson, sorry, did you watch the game at all?
No.
There was no snow on the field.
Well, how?
there was snow on the field pre-game, in the morning of Sunday, but there was no snow on the field.
The sense of snow. It was a Christmassy feel before.
Yeah,
got them all in the mindset of snow.
They were in the festive mood.
Yes, that's funny though. I had no idea. They did shut out the Seahawks though. That's true.
Yes,
that's funny.
Yeah.
That's surprising. I guess they're prepared to clear up the snow. Whatever. We'll move on. Aaron Jones expected to miss 1 to 2 weeks, is the last I heard, with a minor MCL tear. So that opens the door for A.J. Dillon, who had 21 rushes for 66 rushing yards and 2 rushing touchdowns, and 2 receptions for 62 receiving yards, good for 26.8 fantasy points. So I'll ask you, is he a must-start in Jones's absence?
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen how he's eaten into Aaron Jones's fantasy ceiling week after week, and we've kind of reinvigorated the free Aaron Jones movement. But
yes.
Yeah, with A.J. Dillon, with seemingly no other competitors for the backfield touches, yeah, A.J. Dillon's definitely must start.
Yeah, I agree. And this Vikings defense ranks 27th in rushing yards allowed per game at 130.6, so it's a good matchup for him too. Devontae Adams, 7 receptions for 78 yards. Disappointing for fantasy managers that have Adams, hoping that Rodgers would, allow him to bounce back even more, but he still has an extremely reliable floor, and you can't be too disappointed. I'm sure there'll be better days ahead for this elite wide receiver 1. This Vikings defense is relatively weak, but they are easier to run against than pass against, but overall I don't see any worries for any of these fantasy relevant players. We can move on to the Vikings. Kirk Cousins, 25 for 37, 294 passing yards and 2 touchdowns, and 4 rushes for -3 yards. We've talked about this. He's probably a low-end QB1. Would you agree? High-end QB2? Which would you say between those two designations?
I would agree with low-end QB1.
Okay. Yeah, I think that you having him as your backup QB probably is nice. I know that you didn't play him last week because Brady had a seemingly insanely good matchup. We'll talk about him more later, but he's definitely a good second quarterback to have.
Yeah, I think he's startable in most 10-team leagues because I'm trying to pull up the stats. There's a error in my app, but I believe he's still inside the top 10, at 10 maybe.
Yeah, I can check that real quick.
In our scoring at least, but
yeah,
either way.
6 points passing.
Kirk Cousins is... Yeah, and that's in 6-point passing touchdowns. But yeah, Kirk Cousins is reliable, and he's got good weapons around him, so yeah, I like him.
All right, awesome. Packers defense, though, ranks 3rd in passing yards allowed per game at 202.7, so this might not be a game you're super confident starting him in. We'll move on to Dalvin Cook, who had a day that proved that he is a must-start running back. 24 carries for 94 yards and a touchdown, and 3 receptions for 24 yards for a respectable 20.8 fantasy point day. So he's a must-start. That's really all you need to say about him. We can move on to pass catchers. Justin Jefferson, 9 receptions for 143 yards. Adam Thielen, 5 receptions for 65 yards. And Tyler Conklin, 3 receptions for 11 yards and 2 touchdowns. Jefferson led the team in targets with 11. I guess I'll ask you, do you think Thielen is a touchdown-dependent wide receiver too?
I think that, he's been kind of up and down this season. Yeah. And so, yeah, when you look at his game log, the games that he doesn't have a touchdown in, it's single-digit scoring except for this last week. But actually, in Week 9, he had a touchdown and still got only 8.6 points. That being said, I think that he's going to be used in this offense, and it really comes down to how effective Dalvin Cook is. When Dalvin Cook struggles, and we've seen him struggle a little bit in the past few weeks, Adam Thielen is a lot more involved, and so he has a lot more upside. But obviously, Justin Jefferson is the wide receiver that you want in this offense. He's the wide receiver 1 of the crew. But yeah, Adam Thielen is kind of, you kind of temper expectations a little bit.
Yeah, and Justin Jefferson has been slightly disappointing for probably where you drafted him, but not too disappointing. And I expect him to have more days similar to this, so I think you feel great about him. And we've talked about Conklin a lot. Interesting day for him because usually he's been reliable with his receiving yards and receptions, but this day he had a Hunter Henry day. So, do you like that outlook on him that now he's seeing the end zone, and do you think he's worth rostering?
A little bit. I mean, I think that it's a little fluky that he got, 2 touchdowns on 3 catches, but he hasn't had a touchdown since week 3, and so I think he's probably due for it. But he's getting consistent target volume in this offense, and the yardage is usually there. So he's kind of a mid tier tight end. Obviously, the matchup isn't great this week, but I think that Conklin is. I feel better about Conklin than who did we talk about before? Komet.
Oh, okay, not Hunter Henry. Komet.
No, not Hunter Henry.
I wish. Packers defense is strong, ranking third in total yards allowed per game and fourth in points against, as Blake was alluding to. So, I expect the relevant players to do well. But yeah, I think making a reach for Conklin and starting this week may not be the best idea. But we'll move on to the Colts against the Bills. Carson Wentz kind of regressed back to earth. 22 for 34, 180 passing yards, no touchdowns or interceptions, and 4 rushes for -1 yards, only 7.1 fantasy points. Apparently, because he faced the Jaguars last week, so you expected him to have a good game, but apparently this Jaguars pass defense is sneaky good because they held Wentz to that and beat the Bills in Week 9 and held Allen to not many points. So it's interesting.
They certainly have their moments. They just need to kind of get more consistent to be a real threat.
Yeah, agreed. It's Bills defense ranks second in passing yards allowed per game. 190.2 passing yards is all they allow on average, so I don't think you feel great about him in this game. Jonathan Taylor, though, 21 carries for 116 rushing yards and a touchdown, and 6 receptions for 10 yards, 24.6 fantasy points. Led the team in targets with 8, which is interesting. 5th game with 100-plus rushing yards this season, and 9 rushing touchdowns in the past 7 games. I guess I don't know if this is too disrespectful to Christian McCaffrey, but do you think Jonathan Taylor is the rest of season fantasy RB1?
Yeah, so I would say it's an interesting point that you bring up McCaffrey because Jonathan Taylor still hasn't had his bye week. That's week 14.
Yeah.
And so I think that alone might be the deciding factor between him and McCaffrey. But outside of that, he's been outstanding. So I think that, I think he's certainly inside the top 3, top 2 conversation with McCaffrey as long as he stays healthy. But yeah, I mean, you're thrilled if you have Jonathan Taylor on your roster.
Yeah. This Bills defense does rank third in rushing yardage allowed per game at only 83.9 rushing yards, so it'll be interesting to see what he does against them. Michael Pittman, though, 5 receptions for 71 yards, 12.1 fantasy points, proving to be a very reliable fantasy wide receiver. I don't know how amazing you feel against the Bills, but you're probably still starting him because this Bills defense is arguably the best in the NFL, ranking first in total yardage allowed per game at 274.1 and first in NFL points allowed per game at only 15. So they're a legit defense.
Yeah, lower expectations for all Colts, I would say.
Yes. We'll move on to the Bills, though. Josh Allen, 21 for 28, 366 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 1 interception. Bounce back from disappointing Week 9 performance. That's all there really is to say about him. He's a must-start QB, and it's just good to see that he bounced back after a disappointing day. But we'll talk about this backfield, which was extremely strange. Zach, I'll just read the point totals. Zach Moss, 8.7 fantasy points. Devin Singletary, 11.9 fantasy points. Matt Breida, 18 fantasy points. 7 different players registered a carry, and 4 different players had a rushing touchdown. I guess I don't buy Breida. He had 6 touches and 18 points. That's like a Kenyon Drake performance from a few weeks ago. I mean, do you feel the same?
I mean, well, yeah, but in fairness, you weren't really relying on any of these Buffalo running backs, so it really just makes the committee that much more of a thing if Breida sticks around. So yeah, I'm not saying rush out and pick up Matt Breida, but I think that if anything, it just lowers the value of Moss and Singletary.
Agreed. And then the pass catchers, I got a lot of them, and this game was a fantasy mess. But Diggs boomed, had a a performance akin to his 2020 season. He had 8 receptions for 162 receiving yards and 1 touchdown, good for 30.2 fantasy points. That made me very happy. And then you see Emmanuel Sanders with 2 receptions, Cole Beasley with 2 receptions, Dawson Knox with 1 reception, and Gabriel Davis with 3, but 105 receiving yards. I mean, does this kind of put those other fantasy relevant wide receivers back down to earth and make you remember that Diggs is the only really must start in this offense as far as wide receivers?
I think something to keep in context, and I read this earlier today. Let me pull that up just so I get it correct. But I believe it was that no other receiver outside of Diggs saw more than 4 targets.
Wow.
And with that being the case, let me find that. Oh no, it's no other Buffalo pass catcher saw more than 3 targets.
Wow.
So that is a very unconventional stat for this offense. I think that guys like Emmanuel Sanders and Cole Beasley lately have been more reliable than this. We've seen that this team can support multiple pass catchers and be fantasy relevant. I think the biggest surprise of the day, honestly, was probably Dawson Knox in his first game back, only getting 1 catch for 17 yards. But there may be some bias in there because I started him last week. But yeah, I think Gabriel Davis is a flash in the pan. I don't expect that to be a repeat performance by any means. And I'm not panicking on Sanders or Beasley, really, because, Josh Allen is their quarterback, and he's extremely talented.
Yeah, I think it also needs to be kept in mind that, this team had 4 rushing touchdowns, so, they didn't really need to get in the end zone if the pass catchers. I'm glad that Diggs did, but, Allen only threw 2 passing touchdowns, so I expect more from them in the future. And this Colts defense is relatively middle of the road, so I don't think you're really scared by this matchup per se, but it's not a phenomenal one either. We can move on to the Lions versus the Browns. The Lions had their first game that they didn't lose, but they did win it.
Yeah. Let's go Lions.
Yeah. DeAndre Swift, though, we expected a huge workload. This still feels like a typo, even though I know this is right. 33 carries for 130 rushing yards and 3 receptions for 5 yards, 16.5 fantasy points. Both of Detroit's touchdowns were on the ground, but Swift got neither of them, so that's interesting for the random players that vultured him. And this Browns defense ranks 5th in rushing yards allowed per game, 94.7, but I expect Swift to go back to his more versatile role where he gets a lot more receptions, even if he, definitely regresses from 33 carries, so I'm not worried about him.
Yeah, the thing is that the most talented player on the Lions roster is DeAndre Swift, and it's disappointing that you didn't get more points out of it because he did get vultured by a couple of long runs from people that you hardly ever hear of that are also running backs on the Lions. But you have to feel good about that, that volume, that usage. I mean, 36 touches is pretty incredible for a running back.
I agree for sure. T.J. Hawkinson saw 1 target and caught none of them. This is not the first time this season this has happened, right?
That's in 5 quarters of football, by the way.
That is ridiculous. As the consensus tight end 4, tight end 5 going into drafts. I mean, maybe some people thought
top
Pitts
5.
were better, but yeah.
He started strong on the season. The real trouble is that he's got Jared Goff as his quarterback.
Yeah.
I can't stress that enough, how much that influences his value directly. Like, at least Swift can get carries and not be affected by Jared Goff. But, I mean, we've talked about this in the past. The Lions pass catchers are a real who's who of nobodies.
Yeah.
So Hawkinson having a tough day like this, I mean, it doesn't shock me because, of their quarterback situation, but you still have to roll him out next week because it's not really indicative of his talent. It's just kind of a fluke.
Agreed. But it's not a great matchup for him to bounce back in because this Browns defense is strong, ranking 5th in total yardage allowed per game. But they also strangely rank 21st in points allowed per game. So, I mean, they give up touchdowns, but not a ton of yards. But I don't think that I expect the Lions to be the team that scores a bunch on them. But you never know. We can move on to the Browns, though. Dearness Johnson, proven to be a very reliable handcuff if Chubb and Hunt are both out. 19 carries for 99 rushing yards and 7 receptions for 58 receiving yards, 22.7 fantasy points. Led the team in targets with 8. I mean, would you agree that he's a must start as long as Chubb and Hunt are both out?
Yeah, after 2 games, I'm a believer in Dearness Johnson. I think that it's a great offensive line that Cleveland has, and although I haven't heard anything about Nick Chubb, it was close leading into last week, so I would imagine that he's going to be available for this one. But on the off chance that he isn't, Dearness Johnson against this Lions team is a lock in lineups and a must start for sure.
Agreed. So yeah, Chubb was on the COVID list, right? So he should be back, right? Or no?
Yeah, presumably. I think the issue is going to be if he's asymptomatic, because that's an aspect of getting removed from the COVID-19 list, as well as the consecutive negative tests. So no word on that yet, but by Saturday we'll have information on that, hopefully.
Yeah, and then Hunt, has he already been ruled out as of me making these notes, or is he still potentially coming back?
Not officially, but I don't believe he's been designated to return from IR, so probably not available.
Okay. Jarvis Landry only had 4 catches for 26 yards. Why do you think Landry's not seeing more targets in the absence of OBJ?
Because Baker Mayfield struggles as a quarterback.
I think struggles.
Well, I think that's really the case. I mean, honestly, because Jarvis Landry we know is talented. He's always been a high volume guy in the NFL in his NFL career, but it really, I mean, that's kind of the whole reason that OBJ wanted out of Cleveland, because Baker Mayfield struggles, and this team is like, their focus is on running the ball, and so it's not really indicative of, or it's not really conducive for fantasy relevant wide receivers or pass catchers.
Totally agree. OBJ might have a point, which is disappointing for this team because, I mean, it's awesome to see the Browns be playoff contenders, but not for the way they played against the Patriots last week, that's for sure. This Lions defense is weak, though, ranking 28th in total yards allowed per game and 29th in NFL points allowed per game, but they are easier to run against than pass against. Honestly, Dearness Johnson, just any running back that is starting in this offense is the only must start in this offense. Would you agree?
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, we can move on to Washington at Carolina Panthers.
Ron Rivera against Cam Newton.
Yes, we'll talk about that for sure when we talk about Cam Newton. Washington, very surprising win against the Buccaneers. I kind of had a Buccaneers stack in DFS last week. I guess I cursed those teams because I did the same thing for the Cowboys when they played the Broncos in Week 9. So I'll let you all know in the DFS video maybe what team I'm stacking, and then maybe bet against them in real life.
Yeah, I was completely shocked by this game, and it just goes to show you that's you can talk about a game as much as you want. You can look at stats, you can talk about matchups, but at the end of the day, when the game is being played on the field, anything can happen, and that was definitely the case against the Buccaneers last week for Washington.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely. I mean, we've had a few games where it's been like that, where you completely expect the opposite, but again, that's why they play the games. Panthers defense, though, ranks first in passing yards against, only allowing 173.7 on average.
Passing yards allowed.
Yes.
Yeah.
Antonio Gibson, another extremely inefficient day on the ground, but he had 2 rushing touchdowns. He had 24 carries, only 64 rushing yards, but 2 rushing touchdowns. He's just an extremely touchdown-dependent running back, and it's tough to feel safe playing him ever. That's really
I
all
agree
to
with
say
that.
about him.
I agree with that.
And then we have J.D. McKissick, who had 7.9 fantasy points. I mean, we kind of expected him maybe to get more action through the air because we thought that Washington would be playing from behind, but then they just weren't. So that's interesting. Terry McLaurin, 6 receptions for 59 yards, led the team in targets with 8. Kind of a disappointing day for McLaurin, but I do expect him to be a very reliable option for the rest of the season. Probably the only very reliable option in this offense. But this Panthers defense is strong, ranking second in total yards allowed per game and sixth in NFL points allowed per game. But they are much easier to run against than pass against, so maybe Gibson could get some touchdowns. But again, don't feel confident with that. We can move on.
You're hoping for him to find the end zone, and that's never a good feeling.
Especially for like a low end RB1 going into drafts, like that's really disappointing.
Yeah.
Panthers. Cam Newton is unofficially, but set to make a start this week in what should be a good matchup. Although it's interesting because he's facing his former coach, the coach of him for his entire time at the Panthers, right, and in his prime, Ron Rivera, who, I was liking the prospects of Newton starting in this matchup, even though Brady didn't do it. I just think that it is still a good matchup. But, Ron Rivera, if anyone knows how to lock down Cam, I would think it'd be Rivera. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say this. I think the Washington football team just lost Chase Young for the season, and that's a big loss just because he's a very talented pass rusher. So that aspect may help the Panthers in their game against the football team. But that being said, I do agree that, obviously Ron Rivera is going to have some information on Cam Newton that, most coaches wouldn't necessarily have. But at the end of the day, it's the Washington football team. Do I expect them to, strike, do I expect lightning to strike twice? Not necessarily. Now, the Panthers' offense is nothing special outside of McCaffrey and DJ Moore when he has a good quarterback. But, do you really feel confident with those pass catchers with Cam Newton there?
No. I think you have to feel better than how Darnold was playing. And it was interesting to see that Anderson got a touchdown, but I still don't really trust either of them. It's just disappointing.
Yeah, I think what happens is this team really transitions to relying heavily on Christian McCaffrey, and that's good for McCaffrey managers, but the pass catchers, it's a different story with Cam Newton under center.
Yeah, agreed. Washington defense ranks 6th in rushing yards allowed per game at 97.1, but we're talking about Christian McCaffrey, who had 26.1 fantasy points, probably in his first full workload game. He had 10 receptions. He's a must start. We already talked about him and Taylor. It doesn't really matter who is the number one rest of the season running back in fantasy, other than trade talks, but you're starting both of those guys with no question, and you're very lucky to have them, and it's great to see McCaffrey back and healthy. And we already talked about DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson a bit. Again, I don't think you trust either of them. Do you bench DJ Moore? What do you think?
That's a bold choice. It really depends on what your other options are. Because we know DJ Moore's upside. It's obviously really great. He's a borderline wide receiver 1.
Yeah, it was a top 10 wide receiver.
Yeah, but Cam Newton being there as their quarterback, you like the matchup, presumably. If you ignore last week with the Bucs, but I think it really depends. It comes down to who your other pass catchers are, who you can slot in there, but I would still rank DJ Moore as a wide receiver 2, safely. Agreed.
I do agree. This Washington defense this week, ranking 27th in total yards allowed per game and 28th in what I assume is points allowed per game. I forgot to write that down. But they are much easier to pass against than run against. But, you're starting McCaffrey. You're starting Moore, hoping for more from Moore. And, I don't know. I guess Anderson might be worth rostering. If you were thinking about dropping him, I guess don't do it right now. But
yeah, what I would do is if he's available in your league, I would, if you have someone at the end of your bench that you're not really committed to, go ahead and pick him up. I wouldn't start him this week. I'd probably hold off until I see a little bit more consistency out of him because he has been so unreliable thus far. But I think that there's a possibility that he kind of emerges. As we saw, he got a touchdown reception this past week.
Yeah, one of Newton's few throws. It was so ridiculous to see Newton just have like 13.72, like almost all of those points in like a few minutes into the game. It was definitely interesting. They're wanting to let him lead this team.
Yeah, did you see the clip after he got the rushing touchdown? He takes off his helmet, goes, "I'm back."
Yeah, that's so awesome. I like Cam.
Yeah,
I like his personality.
Yeah, that was cool to see. I like him too.
Yeah. All right. Next game, Texans Titans. Tyrod Taylor threw 3 interceptions in his first game back because they were on bye. I think I forgot to label that. Right? Weren't they on bye in week 10? Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, this Titans defense, though, ranks 27th in passing yards allowed per game, which is interesting. I don't think anyone's rushing to start Taylor, though. Running back committee with almost 0 upside, and this defense ranks 7th in rushing yards allowed per game, so not even a good matchup. Brandin Cooks is the only worthwhile option. 6 receptions for 56 yards for 11.6 fantasy points in Week 9. This Titans defense is relatively middle of the road, but they're much easier to pass against than run against. I mean, you're only starting Cooks if you have... You're only rostering Cooks, most likely, out of this team.
Yeah, I would say this. So the stats kind of paint a different picture than how the Titans have been playing lately. They're 8-2.
Yeah, I'm gonna get to that and how it's
no, I
weird
understand.
to me.
I understand, but what I'm saying is that from the perspective of fantasy relevant Texans players, obviously I think you do have to start Brandin Cooks because of his target share. But I wouldn't be surprised if he had a similar game to how he did last week, 11.6. I mean, I think that your expectations are probably going to be lower because the Titans, as a team overall, including their defense, has performed better than their stats indicate.
Agreed. We can move on to the Titans, though. Ryan Tannehill, your favorite fantasy player. 19 for 27, 213 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown. And 5 carries for 1 rushing touchdown. Kind of saved his day. 18.62 fantasy points. Only 2 games this season with more than 2 passing touchdowns, 5 rushing touchdowns in the season. You don't feel confident starting him ever. I think that's all that needs to be said. And it's kind of being a dead horse because you agree.
I went on a rant about Tannehill last week, and I've talked about it multiple times through this podcast that Tannehill has fallen off as a QB1 in fantasy, and through some fault of his pass catchers, but also just him as a player, he's not getting it done like we're used to seeing. And so, yeah, before I get on another rant, I'm just gonna say that he's not really worth rostering in my opinion.
Yeah, and then this backfield, Adrian Peterson, Jeremy McNichols, those 2 combined for 4.8 fantasy points, and Deonta Foreman. I think it's Deonta Foreman.
I think that's correct.
Yeah, 11 carries for 30 yards and 2 receptions for 48. I mean, I dropped McNichols for Foreman, but do you really feel great about rostering any of these running backs?
I don't think it's that big of an upgrade because, like we talked about last week, this is a committee. Yeah. You can't replace Derrick Henry with just one guy. So
yeah.
I think you have the best upside with Foreman just because he's getting the most touches so far. But it's a low end flex play if you're gonna start a Titans running back.
Yeah. This Texans defense ranks second to last in rushing yards allowed per game, so it'll be interesting to see if one of them emerges or if they just all have mediocre days. AJ Brown, 1 catch for 16 yards and 1 rush for 7 yards. And he's had 2 100-plus yard receiving games this season. Don't know why that's written as a question, but it does baffle you. It does baffle you, though.
It comes back to Tannehill. A.J. Brown's floor and ceiling are directly tied to Tannehill's production at quarterback. Tannehill has been inconsistent at quarterback, and that makes A.J. Brown inconsistent at wide receiver. I mean, that's what it comes down to. Even with Julio Jones on IR, A.J. Brown is still a victim of his quarterback's situation. So that's why that is.
Yeah, and then Julio definitely won't be available at the very earliest until week 13. But yeah, you don't feel great about it no matter what for Brown. The Titans, like as you already said, they're 8-2, and it's just ridiculous. They have barely any fantasy relevant players, except for Derrick Henry, of course, when he was healthy. Probably the best fantasy player this season, and we miss him
Yeah,
very
he
much.
was. He was, and personally, I miss him very much. I think that, among other losses that I've had to my team, is gonna probably crush my season.
Yeah, I mean, he could be back for the fantasy playoffs potentially, and he almost certainly will be back for the NFL playoffs, right? So I mean, that makes you feel good about this for him and this team in real life. But this is
Yeah,
kind of an
yeah.
ugly team to be 8-2. It's ridiculous to me. Um, yeah, and this Texans defense though is very weak. But honestly, who cares? I mean, you're probably starting AJ Brown if you have him, and then nobody else.
Yes. Yeah, probably. Like we said, it's a running back by committee, and Tannehill is very inconsistent. Obviously, they can have a good offensive game against the Texans because most teams have. But yeah, I think that you're starting a few of these players, but not many.
Yep. All right, I'll let you take over and bring us the next matchup, which is the 49ers at the Jaguars.
Yeah, so we saw a big game for the 49ers this past week. Elijah Mitchell, 27 carries for 91 yards, only 9.1 fantasy points because, like we've said, he's very pretty much non-existent in the passing game. He underwent a procedure for his broken finger, and we will monitor his status for this week. So, in the event that he is unavailable, Jeff Wilson Jr. is most likely the next man up, but I think it will it will resemble more of a committee if that's the case. That being said, if he is available, he's a solid running back 2, an RB2, because of that limited passing upside.
Yeah.
With George Kittle, 5 catches for 50 yards and a touchdown for 16 fantasy points. Back-to-back games with a touchdown, and I did hear somewhere that was his first time in his career to do that. Do you expect him to keep this momentum, or is it time to sell high on George Kittle?
I do expect him to keep the momentum. If you got lucky with like a tight end pickup, like I know Freiermuth didn't have a great week last week, but let's say you've someone like Freiermuth or Dan Arnold, and you're fine of selling high for Kittle for a different position. I don't think it's a bad idea, but I do expect him to keep the momentum.
Yeah, I would say it really depends on what you can get for Kittle because having a reliable or even semi-reliable tight end whenever you play in a league that requires tight ends, it's very valuable.
It is.
So if George Kittle does keep this up, you're happy with him for this second half of the season. I think he's probably going to keep the momentum up as well. I agree with you.
What was his injury that he was dealing with that held him out?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
I don't either. And was it bothering him at the beginning of the season, or is it just something that he got?
Again, I do not remember. This is
on
the fly.
Yeah, either way, you feel good about him, especially if it was like he was dealing with this all season. But if not, regardless, you still feel good to see him come back from injury and put up these numbers.
Yeah, so somebody who may not keep the momentum, as we've clearly seen, is Brandon Ayuk. 5.6 fantasy points in Week 10. I'm more worried that Weeks 8 and 9 were the outlier. Or do you think that this is more due to Garoppolo only having 19 pass attempts?
That is interesting. That Garoppolo, that definitely could have limited him. I'd like to see Garoppolo have a somewhat heavy passing day with Ayuk, Kittle, and Debo all being there and see what happens. I wouldn't drop Ayuk like we were recommending earlier in the season. I think you got to wait for a game like that where he puts up these numbers with Garoppolo throwing a lot for you to
so
be
you're
like, okay,
so you're
going
to pick him back up and hold him.
I would. Yeah.
Okay.
I do think I want to see a game where Garoppolo throws a lot and Ayuk does this again to really be like, okay, that was an outlier.
Okay, so just for perspective, the game script of this one, so the 49ers won 31-10 against the Rams,
which was very surprising.
Mitchell had 27 carries. Debo Samuel had 5 carries. Jeff Wilson had 10 carries, and Garoppolo had 2 carries. So they ran it down the Rams' throat. They rammed the ball down the Rams' throat. So I think that this is an ideal game script for the 49ers who love using their running backs. But yeah, I mean, I I get what you're saying with the limited pass attempts from Garoppolo, but I still am I'm still kind of worried that his previous 2 weeks were the outliers for his fantasy season. I just I don't think that for whatever reason he's just not the same player that he was at the end of last season.
I'll ask you this: would you drop him without any question for like Bateman?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
If you don't have someone like that on your waiver wire, though, I think you hold on to him.
Sure. And I mean, it's a good matchup. We're talking about the Jaguars up next. So, James Robinson, 12 carries for 57 yards and a touchdown, 4 catches for 27 yards, finished with 18.4 fantasy points. San Francisco ranks 23rd in rushing yards per game at 122 and 21st in points allowed per game at 23.6. So, I mean, and we'll get to this in a moment, but outside of James Robinson, who can you trust in this Jaguars offense, fantasy-wise?
I mean, I know you're about to talk about Dan Arnold, but Dan Arnold.
Yeah,
but
he led the team in receiving yards and receptions in consecutive weeks. He had 5 catches for 67 yards for 13.7 fantasy points. I mean, honestly, he seems like the only pass catcher that you can trust, and I think that you're going to agree with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think Shenault has had 9 receptions in the past 3 games, and I think Jones. I mean, I'm looking that up real quick. It was surprisingly low what their combined totals were. Yeah, Jones also was 10. So 19 between them two in 3 games. And then Dan Arnold has stepped in. So, I guess he's the only one you trust.
Yeah, and that's a scary look for that offense, especially fantasy-wise.
Surprising. I mean, you'd think it has to go somewhere, the passing, because they're playing from behind. You'd think it'd have to go somewhere. And they have somewhat talented wide receivers, but it's not getting it done other than Arnold.
That's right. All right, so let's move on to the Dolphins at the Jets. This is a real barn burner here.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so the New York Jets rank near bottom, 29th or worse in all defensive categories. So obviously it's a good matchup for the Dolphins offense. Tua is expected to start, which means you feel good about Waddle and Gesicki. And Week 11 is an odd week, so Myles Gaskin should go off in this great matchup. I mean, is there more analysis? Because we've seen it. We've seen it. We've seen the pattern of Myles Gaskin going up and down, and the only thing that's stayed consistent, regardless of matchup, really, has been the week number.
Yeah, so it'd be interesting with this seemingly great matchup for him to finally go against that trend. So, no, I got nothing else to say about him.
Yeah, and then Will Fuller with his finger injury, still unlikely to play, but I believe that, especially in a league or in a season where there have been a lot of players placed on IR, Will Fuller might have fallen to the waiver wire in your league, and so that might be someone to consider, because with Tua starting at in this offense, I think that Will Fuller has a spot for some catches.
Yeah, I think I've picked him up and dropped him twice, and he's never played for me, and now he's back on the waiver wire in our league. So
yeah.
There you go. I just didn't have the room for him like I thought I would.
Yeah, and I think that's probably going to be the case for a lot of leagues. So keep an eye on that. It was the head coach said last week that it would be a possibility that he plays this week. That's not looking like the case in Week 11, so maybe get ahead of it now while you can for Week 12. Yep. On to the Jets. My notes here, I'm going to read them as I had them before I found out that Joe Flacco was going to start. I said, if Zach Wilson plays, I'm nervous for all Jets offensive players. If Mike White plays, I'm less nervous but still not confident. Really, nothing has changed with the news that Joe Flacco is going to start. I'm more on the side of Mike White than Zach Wilson, but honestly, Miami's coming off of an impressive defensive performance against the Ravens. They held them to 10 points.
Yeah. And
I think there's very little upside for the Jets players on offense. I mean, Joe Flacco, you can talk about him because, he's a former Bronco great, but...
Oh, my God.
I don't think he's gotten much better in that time since he was on the Broncos. I don't really expect a lot from him in this game. And so because of that, I expect very little from Jets offense in general.
Yeah, and then you'd think that someone that would be immune would be Michael Carter. I mean, he
But
has
Tevin
had two
Coleman's back.
games. Yeah, Tevin Coleman's back, and also a lot of Michael Carter's points in the past 4 weeks have come from receptions, so that doesn't make you feel good about the QB play necessarily. And Tevin Coleman's back, so could have been a sell high candidate potentially. I mean, you're not selling super high on him, but
Yeah,
we
we talked about it.
Yep.
We talked about it. We said, like, who's going to be like, oh, Michael Carter? Like, that's a big name. But yeah, the reality is that the Jets are in trouble yet again. So I think there's not much else to talk about there. We'll go ahead and move on to the Saints against the Eagles. And I've got very brief notes for the Saints. Yeah. If Alvin Kamara plays, he's the only player you're starting. If Alvin Kamara misses, Mark Ingram, who had 14 carries for 47 yards and a touchdown, 4 catches for 61 yards, finishing with 20.8 fantasy points, and the new franchise leader in rushing for the Saints, he's the only player that you're starting.
Yeah.
The reality is that the Saints are devoid of fantasy-relevant pass catchers. Now, we have seen people like Deontay Smith, and we have seen people like... or Deontay Harris. I'm drawing a blank. Yeah. Either way, like, the fact that I can't name them, Marquez Callaway, these guys are... they're just not getting it done week to week, so you can't count on them, and it's just not a good look. I mean, Trevor Siemian's the quarterback. Still, presumably, you don't feel great about that. It's the running back. Whoever's starting at running back is the only fantasy-relevant player.
Yep, I agree.
And then on to the Eagles. Philadelphia ran all over the Broncos in Week 10, and I hate to say that to you, but New Orleans ranks number 1 in rushing yards allowed per game at 72.9. So there is a possibility that Miles Sanders returns, and the coach has already said if he's healthy and available, he is their starter. So along with that, you got to lower expectations for Jordan Howard and Boston Scott, not only because of the matchup, but also because of Miles Sanders. And then you're just going to need to see Hurts deliver with his arm if the Eagles are going to win this game. Because Jalen Hurts has been wildly inconsistent. He's failed to throw for 200-plus yards in each of his last 3 games. That's not what you're looking for from your quarterback.
Not at all.
He hasn't thrown more than 2 passing touchdowns since Week 1.
Jeez.
Also not a good statistic.
Oh, my.
So, Devonta Smith, 4 catches for 66 yards and 2 touchdowns. He has finished with 22.6 fantasy points in consecutive weeks. Are you selling high on Devonta Smith?
I think it's a pretty good idea. I don't trust him or his outlook for the rest of the season. I think that he would be a smart player to sell high. Yeah, I think so. Obviously, it depends on what you can get for him, but you're trying to sell high.
Yeah, so here's some perspective. He is position rank 25, so he's wide receiver 25. And his fantasy football playoffs, if you play through Week 18, are Washington twice in Weeks 15 and 17, the Giants in Week 16, and Dallas in Week 18. So Week 18 is the only one that you're really worried about.
Every game's a divisional matchup. That's interesting.
Yeah, but I think that, if you can... Because of the inconsistency from Jalen Hurts and how Devonta Smith has really been, pretty mediocre despite being wide receiver 25, if you can include that playoff schedule as part of your selling point for Devonta Smith, I think that's a good option.
That's smart.
Yeah, because, really, that's the only thing that you can really say positive about this guy, because without these touchdowns, obviously he's had 2 games that have been over 100 receiving yards, but he's been really not that great. He's got multiple games of under 6 fantasy points, and that's not what you're looking for from a wide receiver 1 in an offense.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that would be a smart pitch for the fantasy playoff schedule.
Yeah, all right. So let's move on to Bengals versus the Raiders. I was telling you pre-recording, Las Vegas just allowed Mahomes to throw for 5 TDs and over 400 yards on Sunday Night Football.
Yeah.
So I love the matchup for Joe Burrow, his pass catchers in Jamar Chase and T. Higgins, and even Joe Mixon to get involved because he's been pretty consistent lately. The only player that I'm down on is Tyler Boyd. He had one catch for 11 yards on 2 targets in Week 9. As long as this receiving core is healthy, Boyd can't be trusted. Do you agree?
Yeah, you finally pulled the trigger and dropped him, and I don't
I
blame
did.
you.
I
No one
finally.
picked him up.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. So I think that the rest of that offense, outside of CJ Uzama, who likely no one's really starting except in deep leagues. Those main 4 are still going to have probably a pretty good matchup against the Raiders. Moving on to them, Hunter Renfrow, he's emerging as a reliable wide receiver 2 with upside in this offense. He had 7 catches for 46 yards and a touchdown to finish with 17.6 fantasy points. He has quietly had double-digit scoring in all but one game this season. So I say emerging, but he's probably he's been really reliable. So
he's emerged.
Yeah, I think he's emerged. And then on the other side, Darren Waller, 4 catches for 24 yards for 6.4 fantasy points. It is only his second game with single-digit points, but you drafted him at a high spot, presumably. I do expect him to bounce back this week. Do you?
I do agree, for sure.
All right, let's talk about Cowboys-Chiefs. Big-time shootout potential in this one, am I right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. This will be a very interesting game.
I think this will be a very popular game in DFS, and we'll talk about that in Saturday's show, but
yeah.
Dallas bounced back from Week 9 in a major way, just absolutely crushing the Falcons 43-3. Ezekiel Elliott had 14 carries for 41 yards, 2 touchdowns that he punched in at probably the 1-yard line, and 3 catches for 15 yards, finished with 20.76 fantasy points because he did get a throw in there for, I think, 4 yards. And then Tony Pollard had 11 carries for 42 yards, so a more efficient day than Zeke, and 6 catches for 56 yards. A better receiving day. 15.8 fantasy points is what he finished with. They essentially split touches for near identical rushing totals. So, do you have any concern for Zeke moving forward if the touchdowns aren't there for him?
I do. I roster Zeke and Pollard on my main team. And I'm looking to maybe sell high. But what I mean by that is okay, Zeke, if healthy, barring injuries and all that, he's still a, very safe RB1. But when I say sell high, I think that by the end of the season, he's going to be more like a low-end RB1 with how he's trending with his split carries and split rushing yards of Pollard. But I think you can sell him as a strong RB1. So that's what I mean by that. It's not like I'm saying, oh, panic on Zeke, but I think now would be a good time to sell if you're wanting to get back, some safer options and maybe a wide receiver or 2. I think it might not be a bad idea to look for that because I think people might not look at his stats. They see, 20 points, and he was coming off of 2 somewhat weak games, and they're like, oh, he bounced back, but I don't know if I buy it. But you don't feel awful about him. I'm just saying he could be someone who falls in the rankings after the coming weeks.
Yeah, I think what it really means is that his fantasy ceiling is going to be limited because Tony Pollard is having very efficient touches, and that takes away work from Zeke, whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that is something to consider for managers of Zeke out there. Let's talk about the Chiefs on the other side of this matchup. They are the home team, and in Week 10, Kansas City reminded you why you drafted Mahomes, Kelsey, and Hill in the early rounds of fantasy drafts. I mean, they all had fantastic days. The real question is, do you expect them to keep the momentum against Dallas?
I do. I think that, the Falcons obviously couldn't do it, but the Broncos could, so I think the Chiefs definitely can. And seeing Mahomes have this day reminds you why, people would almost go as far to say the next GOAT, which I don't think is true. But, he reminded you that he is
maybe slow your
good.
roll.
Yeah, I'd slow your roll. But, I feel good about him, obviously, after that.
Yeah, I do too. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if Trevon Diggs shadows Tyreek Hill at all, or how the Cowboys approach Kansas City's offense defending it. But Yeah, I think that overall, I feel. I mean, this game was everything that you could have asked for from the Chiefs' offensive players. We can talk about Darrell Williams. 11 for 43, that's whatever. 9 catches for 101 yards and a touchdown. He finished with 29.4 fantasy points.
And his
I
touchdown
mean,
catch was insane.
yes, it was a true snagbert.
Yes, for sure.
The thing to note is his previous season high was 6 catches back in week 8. Is this something you should expect moving forward, or is this more of an outlier, you think?
I mean, it'll be interesting to see. It all depends on CEH. It'll be interesting to see what happens to each of their values when he comes back. If you have CEH, I might be looking to sell before he starts playing again. And if you have Williams, I don't know anyone's going to buy that much, but you could add him onto a trade to get some extra players out of it or extra quality. But I really have no idea what will happen to Williams when CEH returns. That's all.
Yeah,
all I can really
we
say.
talked about. I brought up the idea of selling CEH a couple weeks ago,
Yeah.
saying that we've seen how Kansas City has utilized the running back position, and that was when Gore, and I'm forgetting his first name
Derek,
obviously
I
because
think.
Derek Gore, that's correct. When Derek Gore popped up and kind of had an effective day on the ground, it made you worry as a CEH manager of of how they would value him when he returned. So coming off of this game from Darrell Williams, I feel like your opportunity to sell high, or not even to sell high, but just to offload CEH from your team has kind of closed because we've seen how well these backups have performed in CEH's absence. It makes it very difficult to make a compelling case for any team to take CEH on.
Yeah, I agree.
So I think if you were going to do it, you probably should have done it sooner, but it might be something to still consider because it does seem like it's not going to be a very valuable position that CEH has in this offense at this point.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about Cardinals at Seahawks. Kyler Murray, his ankle, DeAndre Hopkins, hamstring. They've missed the previous 2 weeks, and they have a bye in week 12. So, do you expect one or both of these guys to play, or do you think they're going to be held out until the bye and not be available until week 13?
Um, I don't know about Hopkins. I think that they might hold him out just because they have so many options. But Kyler, I'm feeling optimistic about, especially since I think Colt McCoy picked up an injury, right, in week 10?
Yeah, he did not finish the game.
I think that I feel optimistic about Kyler. I don't know if that's biased because I haven't. I'm just hoping he plays. And again, I don't know the current status of both of their injuries with much detail, but I could see Hopkins, just as far as like them playing it safe, he'd be more likely to be the one to be benched just because they have so many, you know, reliable receiving options.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a possibility considering that the bye is next week and hamstring injuries, especially for, explosive runners like a wide receiver, are difficult injuries to kind of work to play through. So that may be a possibility. We'll be monitoring that going into the weekend. That being said, Christian Kirk, 7 catches for 58 yards. He finished with 12.8 fantasy points. He's been a double-digit scorer in 5 of his last 6 games and been relatively reliable regardless of who's at quarterback. So are you buying the struggles of the other Arizona pass catchers because of Colt McCoy being the quarterback, or is this something else?
I mean, I just think that there's only so many, only so many passing attempts, and I think Kirk has solidified his role as the next best option when Hopkins is out, and just the next best option in general. And I think everybody else just kind of detracts from each other's value. So I think Kirk is the number 2 guy, and I think you roll with him, especially if Hopkins is out.
Yeah, I feel pretty good about that. I mean, I think the ceiling isn't, it's not the best, but it's probably pretty good considering where you drafted Christian Kirk.
Oh, if you even did draft him, yeah. Yeah, I think, again, the ceiling's limited just because, the same reasoning that all the other pass catchers are struggling fantasy-wise.
All right, let's talk about the Seahawks. This was the first time, and you referenced this earlier, but this was the first time that Russell Wilson and the Seahawks were shut out. So Gerald Everett led the team in receptions with 8 and yards with 63. Better days are obviously ahead, and it is a tough matchup against Arizona. They rank 5th in passing yards allowed per game and points allowed per game at 18. And I'll just tell you this from someone who's been watching football for a little while, divisional matchups, especially the NFC West, I don't know what it is about this division, but they always seem to be competitive games. Remember when Colin Kaepernick was with the 49ers?
Yes.
Yeah. And they were a pretty prolific offense. And I remember in that season when they played the Seahawks, it was like 6-9 was like the final score. It was a very low scoring game. So I think that, for whatever reason, NFC West matchups are very competitive. They're very defensive oriented. And so I don't necessarily. Obviously, I don't think it's going to be as bad as it was against the Packers last week. And you're obviously starting DK because he's been so reliable outside of a few games. But what are your thoughts on Tyler Lockett?
I mean, I do think that you have to trust what Wilson can bring to his value in the future. Obviously, it didn't happen this game, but like you said, this is the first time Wilson has ever been shut out in the NFL. So I don't buy that that's going to be a common thing. I expect this offense to start going again, and I think Lockett will benefit. I would say it was because of the snow, but the snow wasn't there, so that can't be the reason.
Yeah, the snow went away.
But I do think that I think you got to roll Lockett back out there with Wilson being the starting QB just because of his ridiculous ceiling. Like, he doesn't have a ceiling, honestly. Like, he can just absolutely explode, and it's just hard to see that on your bench, especially in our league when we start so many players.
I totally agree with you. I think that for those of you who drafted Tyler Lockett, you should have known going into the season that he was a risk-reward type of player. And I think that maybe, his final standing, I believe he was wide receiver 6 going into the season this year. I think that kind of skewed people into thinking that he was more consistent than he really was. It was really that he boomed on several games and he busted on a few games. So far this season, it has definitely been more busts than booms. But with Russell Wilson back, you have to keep in mind that with Geno Smith there, although DK was getting all the touchdowns, it's not really the same kind of player that Tyler Lockett is. And so with Wilson back, I feel better about Lockett. I think that, last week, like you said, it's the first time Russell Wilson's been shut out. And so I don't expect that to be the case this week. But again, it comes back to like how I feel about this division and how they play each other. So it could really go either way. I don't feel confident starting Tyler Lockett, but I think you have to because of his upside.
Yeah, I mean, for the same reasons you were just saying, I certainly wasn't targeting Lockett in drafts. I mean, he was definitely his final position rank is definitely skewed in the correct direction for valuing him too high.
Yeah. So let's talk about the Sunday night matchup with the Steelers coming off of an embarrassing tie with the Lions and the Chargers coming off of a loss against the Vikings. So I'll start here. Mason Rudolph, he did all right. He had 50 pass attempts. He completed 30 of them for 242 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. And you can monitor Ben's availability, but honestly, it doesn't really make a big difference. We were talking about Big Ben, how he should probably retire after this year. He's been rough.
Yeah.
And the Chargers rank 4th in passing yards allowed per game. It's a tough matchup regardless of who's at quarterback. The bright side for the Steelers offense is Najee Harris. 26 carries, 105 yards. Didn't find the end zone, but he also had 4 catches for 28 yards, finishing with 17.3 fantasy points. The Chargers rank last in rushing yards allowed per game at 155.1. So I expect another big performance from Harris.
I agree.
Yeah, and then and then Ray McCloud is the only player that I'm going to focus on. He had 9 catches for 63 yards, 15.3 fantasy points. He had 12 targets in Week 10. He had 10 targets in all games combined, Weeks 1 through 9. So with Smith-Schuster out and Claypool week to week, assuming he does not play, is McLeod worth rostering, or is this just a fluke?
I mean, honestly, even if you think it is a fluke, I feel like you can't, unless you just have insane wide receiver depth, I don't think you can feel that much better about your worst wide receiver on your roster to not, take the chance and go after the guy who had 12 targets. I think that he will certainly regress from this, but I don't know. I'm leaning more towards a fluke, but maybe worth rostering just if you would never think to start your last wide receiver.
Yeah, I think the 10 targets in weeks 1 through 9 combined is kind of a big indication that this guy has been a product of circumstance with Claypool and Smith-Schuster out last week. So Claypool currently has a projection for the week. We'll monitor his status going into the weekend. But assuming he doesn't play, assuming Claypool is unavailable, McLeod, he does present some upside in this offense. Yeah, and then the other side, Chargers. Pittsburgh ranks 9th in passing yards allowed per game and 8th in points allowed per game at 20.6. Justin Herbert had another disappointing day. 195 passing yards for 1 touchdown and 1 interception. He finished with 12 fantasy points. He's been under 14 fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. So how concerned are you if you roster Justin Herbert?
We've seen him have insanely great games this season, so I don't think you're too concerned. I saw a graphic this past week of just like how he never even attempted to throw a deep ball in the entire game against the Vikings. I expect him to bounce back, but I'm getting really sick of every other week feeling like I expect him to bounce back, but I do.
Yeah. The talent is there. It's just I think he's been on a bad stretch, and I think it's, it hasn't really affected Keenan Allen in the same way it's affected Mike Williams, but Williams, 4 catches for 33 yards. He's been a single-digit scorer in 5 of his last 6 games. What do you do if you roster him?
I think you bench him. I don't know. That's really tough. It's a similar feeling, I guess, to DJ Moore, is how I feel about Williams.
Or Tyler Lockett.
I was going to say that too. Except those players are even more proven in the past than just Williams having a hot start to this season. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I'm not envious of having Williams at all.
Not like you were in the first quarter of the season.
For sure. Yeah, that's a good way to phrase it.
Yeah, the reality is, you drafted him late. He was a flyer, kind of a breakout potential, and he did for the first quarter of the season, and then he's plummeted back to earth. And so I totally understand if you're considering benching him moving forward, because he needs to prove himself, and part of that comes from Justin Herbert's struggles, but on the other hand, Keenan Allen has not struggled. He's been very consistent, putting up good numbers in this offense despite Justin Herbert's production. So and we talked about this before, that Keenan Allen has traditionally been the most reliable pass catcher in this offense, and we thought maybe Mike Williams has surpassed him, but it seems like that's clearly not the case, as Keenan continues to be consistent, and Williams is kind of showing that he's not quite that guy yet.
Yeah. If you managed to sell high on Williams, congratulations.
Yeah, you really came out good on that end, assuming that you had a good player on the other side of that trade.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the Monday night matchup. I'm looking forward to this personally because I want to see the Buccaneers bounce back. I want to see Brady have a good game. But But here's how I'll start it. The Giants are coming off of a bye, and you need to monitor the injuries of this pretty much this entire team because they've been plagued by them all season long. The Washington football team proved that Tampa Bay can be defeated. However, Tampa Bay is at home in primetime football. I expect them to turn things around in a big way. What say you?
I agree. I think it'd be really hard to bank on the Buccaneers just flopping again. And, I mean, Saquon's back for the Giants, but, that doesn't really scare me with how this game will end up going, and it doesn't really even matter for fantasy with the Buccaneers offense, but, yeah, I do expect them to bounce back.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, we're going to need to monitor the injuries of Antonio Brown and Rob Gronkowski. I think Chris Godwin should be all right, considering that he played the entirety of that last game in Week 10. And we'll have more information on that by Saturday, hopefully. But, the reality is that I think, Brady and the Bucs are going to bounce back. They're going to turn things around because, we talked about the Washington football team's defense not scaring you, and it turned out to be wrong, but I think the same analysis applies to the Giants' defense. It doesn't scare you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so from that perspective, obviously you know who you're starting with the Buccaneers. One bad game is not going to dissuade you from starting any of these guys, so I think it should be a convincing win for the Buccaneers on Monday night, and we'll have more information on injuries hopefully by Saturday. So we'll get those to you guys. And outside of that, Carson, if you don't have anything else to say, I appreciate you guys listening to the episode. Like I've said multiple times, we'll have another episode out on Saturday, including a DFS podcast. So without further ado, thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Peace out.